ID. Let's go.
Sure, it's right here.
Thanks. You're done. Outside.
Wait, that's my mom.
Outside.
Hey, don't touch me.
Hands behind your back. Move.
Are you serious?
The footage would become one of the most watched videos of that year, replayed on news networks, dissected by legal experts, and shared millions of times across every social media platform imaginable. But before it became a symbol, before it sparked protests and policy debates, it was just 37 seconds of raw, unfiltered terror captured on a quiet street in Maplewood Heights, a suburb that prided itself on its manicured lawns and friendly waves between neighbors. The body camera footage opens with the view from inside a patrol car. Through the windshield, you can see the kind of neighborhood that appears in real estate advertisements. Two-story homes with attached garages, basketball hoops and driveways, a yellow fire hydrant freshly painted, American flags hanging from porches. The timestamp in the corner reads 5:23 p.m. on a Thursday evening. The golden hour when families are coming home from work and children are being called inside for dinner. Two uniformed officers step out of the vehicle. Neither announces their presence with the customary greeting one might expect when approaching a citizen's home. There is no polite introduction, no measured explanation. Instead, there is only the sharp bark of commands, sudden and aggressive, cutting through the peaceful suburban air like a blade. A black man stands on his front porch. He has just arrived home, his keys still in his right hand, a canvas tote bag filled with groceries hanging from his left shoulder. The bag bulges with the shapes of produce and bread, the mundane purchases of a family dinner. His back is partially turned toward the street because he has just unlocked his front door. The door is cracked open perhaps 4 inches, and from somewhere inside the house comes the faint sound of a child's voice calling out to him. The officers do not introduce themselves. They do not explain why they are there. They simply shout orders with an intensity that suggests they have already determined this man is dangerous, already decided that force will be necessary. The man turns, clearly startled, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm in the space of a heartbeat. His hands rise automatically, palms open, a gesture of compliance that has been taught to black men in America for generations, passed down like a survival instinct from father to son. But compliance will not save him today. Before he can finish a single sentence, before he can even complete the words that are forming on his lips, one officer closes the distance between them with alarming speed. The impact is audible through the body camera's microphone. The man's body slams against the wooden porch railing, and for a moment, the camera captures the shock in his eyes, the absolute incomprehension of what is happening to him on the steps of his own home. The second officer grabs his legs, and together they bring him down to the concrete porch. His head strikes the steps with a sound that will later cause viewers to wince, to look away, to feel a cold sensation spreading through their chests. The grocery bag splits open upon impact, and the contents scatter across the porch. A carton of eggs cracks, the yolk spreading across the weathered concrete like something wounded and dying. From inside the house, children begin to scream. If you think you know where this story is going, I promise you there are layers to this case that even the viral footage could not reveal. Stay with me until the end, because what happened to this family and what it exposed about an entire system is something everyone needs to understand. The man pinned to that porch was Terrence Washington. He was 44 years old, a family therapist who had spent the last 18 years working with troubled youth in the county's most underserved communities. He was also a father, a husband, a homeowner, and a man who had never once in his entire life been on the wrong side of the law. Not a parking ticket, not a warning, not a single negative interaction with police beyond the routine traffic stops that every black man in America learns to navigate with careful, studied patience. Terrence had lived in that house on Birchwood Lane for 13 years. He and his wife, Denise, had purchased it shortly before the birth of their third child. They had chosen the neighborhood specifically for its reputation as a safe, family-oriented community. The schools were good. The crime rate was low. Neighbors knew each other's names and looked out for one another. It was the kind of place where children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where block parties happened twice a year, where people borrowed cups of sugar and returned them with homemade cookies. Every Sunday, Terrence could be found in his backyard, tending to the vegetable garden he had built with his eldest son 2 summers ago. The garden had started as a school project, but had become something more, a ritual of connection between father and child, a weekly tradition of dirt under fingernails and the patient work of growing something from nothing. Tomatoes grew there, and peppers, and squash. Terrence had painted the raised beds himself, a deep forest green that matched the shutters on the house. He was the kind of man who knew the names of every child on his block. When new families moved in, he was among the first to knock on their doors with a welcome basket. He coached Little League Baseball on Saturday mornings and led youth mentorship workshops at the community center 3 evenings a week. The irony of those workshops would become one of the most bitter details of this entire case, because one of the topics Terrence regularly covered was how young black men should conduct themselves during encounters with law enforcement. He taught them to remain calm, to keep their hands visible, to comply with instructions to survive. And now here he was, face pressed against the cold concrete of his own porch, following every single piece of advice he had ever given. And it meant nothing. His middle daughter, 11 years old, had gymnastics practice on Thursday afternoons. As he did every week, Terrence had parked near the recreation center to wait for her practice to end. He had texted his wife to let her know he would be picking up groceries on the way home. He had stopped at the supermarket, purchased ingredients for the chicken stir-fry that was scheduled for that evening's dinner, and driven the remaining few blocks to his house on Birchwood Lane. There was nothing unusual about any of it, nothing suspicious, nothing remotely worthy of police attention. It was a Thursday like any other Thursday, an evening like any other evening, until it wasn't. What Terrence did not know, what he could not have known, was that his routine had been observed and misinterpreted by someone whose fear would set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. The phone call that destroyed a Thursday evening arrived at the emergency dispatch center at 5:09 p.m. The recording would later be obtained by journalists, analyzed by legal experts, and played on national television. But at the time, it was treated as routine, logged, and dispatched with the same bureaucratic efficiency as any other call. The caller was a woman named Sandra Lawson. She lived 5 houses down from the recreational center in a beige colonial with white trim and a perfectly maintained front lawn. Her voice on the recording is calm, almost casual, with that particular tone of entitled concern that dispatchers hear dozens of times each week. "Yes, I need to report something suspicious," she said. "There's a tall black man sitting in a car near the playground. He's been there for a while, and I've noticed him watching the children." The dispatcher asked follow-up questions, as protocol required. Had the man approached any children? Had he spoken to anyone? Had he done anything threatening or illegal? No, Sandra admitted. He had not. He was simply sitting in his car. But she had noticed him there before, she added, and something about his presence made her uncomfortable. The way he was watching, she said. It just felt wrong. That was the extent of it. No crime had been committed. No threatening behavior had occurred. A man had sat in a parked car near a public recreational facility, and a woman who did not know him had decided that his presence was cause for concern. She did not approach him to ask if he needed help. She did not consider that he might have a perfectly legitimate reason for being there. She saw a black man and felt fear, and she allowed that fear to be translated into a phone call that would be logged as a possible child predator. The dispatcher recorded the call as exactly that, possible predator in a residential area. The phrase was clinical, automatic, and devastating. It coded the entire situation in the worst possible light before a single officer had laid eyes on Terrence Washington. It transformed a man waiting for his daughter into a threat to be neutralized. 2 patrol officers were assigned to respond. They were given minimal information. Tall black male, possibly watching children, currently near the recreation center, but might be mobile. They were told to approach with caution. They were primed for confrontation before they even started their engine. By the time they located Terrence, he had already left the recreation center with his daughter and made his grocery run. He was pulling into his own driveway, returning to his own home, thinking about dinner and homework help and the routine rhythms of family life. The officers saw a black man matching the vague description they had been given and immediately categorized him as their target. They did not run his plates to verify ownership of the vehicle. They did not check the address to see if he might live there. They did not wait and observe to assess whether there was any actual threat. They saw a black man, and they had been told to see a predator, so that is exactly what they saw. The gap between Sandra Lawson's phone call and the violence that followed was not a communication error or a misunderstanding. It was a system functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Fear was reported, fear was transmitted, fear became violence, and an innocent man paid the price. Let me take you back to that porch, because the details matter. Every single second of what happened in that space matters, and the footage captured all of it. When the officers stepped out of their patrol car, Terrence Washington had no reason to believe they were there for him. He was standing on his own property, keys in hand, grocery bag on his shoulder. The front door was already cracked open. His youngest daughter, only 5 years old, had heard his car pull into the driveway and had run to greet him. Her small face was visible through the gap in the door, bright with anticipation, waiting for her daddy to come inside. The first command was a shout. "Hey, step away from the door!" Terrence turned, confused. His brow furrowed. He was trying to process what was happening, why 2 uniformed officers were on his property, why they were shouting at him in front of his home. His first instinct, born from years of navigating a world that viewed black men with suspicion, was to comply. He lifted his hands slowly, palms facing outward. The keys dangled from his right hand. The grocery bag began to slip from his shoulder. "This is my house," he said. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who worked with at-risk youth and understood the importance of de-escalation. He was trying to give them information, trying to help them understand that they had made an error. But the officers were not listening. They had arrived with a story already written in their minds, and Terrence's words did not match that story. One officer closed the distance with alarming speed, crossing the lawn in a half-dozen strides. Before Terrence could finish another sentence, before he could show identification, before he could do anything at all, he was grabbed. The impact against the porch railing drove the air from his lungs. The grocery bag fell, splitting open as it hit the concrete. A jar of spaghetti sauce shattered, red spreading across the gray surface like something terrible was already bleeding. His phone skittered across the porch and came to rest against a planter his wife had filled with autumn flowers. The second officer grabbed his legs. Terrence felt himself being pulled backward, off balance, unable to brace himself. His shoulder hit the porch first, then his face. The rough concrete scraped against his cheekbone. His glasses flew off and landed somewhere he could not see. The world became a blur of motion and shouting and pressure, so much pressure, as the officers forced him onto his stomach and pinned him there. A knee pressed down on the back of his neck. The weight was immediate and crushing. Terrence could feel his throat compressing, his airway narrowing. He tried to speak, tried to tell them again that this was his house, that they were making a mistake, but the words came out broken and gasped. "Stop resisting," one of the officers shouted. "Stop resisting." But Terrence was not resisting. His hands were limp at his sides, palms open, fingers splayed. His body was entirely motionless, except for the rise and fall of his chest as he struggled to breathe. He was complying completely, and they were shouting at him to stop resisting anyway. The accusation was not a description of his actions. It was a script, a pre-written justification that allowed them to continue doing what they had already decided to do. His youngest daughter appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were wide, her small face frozen in an expression that no 5-year-old should ever have to wear. She did not understand what was happening. She only knew that her father was on the ground and men in uniforms were hurting him. She began to scream. The sound of that child's voice cut through the chaos like nothing else could. It was high and sharp and filled with a terror that transcended language. Anyone who has watched the footage will tell you that the moment they heard that scream, something inside them changed. It was the sound of innocence witnessing brutality. It was the sound of a family being broken in real time. Terrence's 11-year-old daughter pushed past her little sister and stepped onto the porch. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the officers, looked at her father pinned beneath them, and she pleaded, "Please stop hurting my daddy, please. He didn't do anything wrong." The officers did not acknowledge her. They did not pause. They did not reassess what they were doing based on the obvious evidence that this was a family home, that this man was clearly not a threat. that they were traumatizing children on their own porch. They continued their work as if the crying children were merely background noise, as if their pleas were irrelevant to the serious business of subduing a dangerous predator. Except there was no predator. There was only Terrence Washington, a family therapist who had spent his life helping children, lying face down on concrete while his own children begged strangers to stop hurting him. What do you think was going through Terrence's mind in those moments? What would be going through yours? Drop a comment below and tell me how you think you would react if this happened to someone you loved. The first neighbor to intervene was a woman named Dorothy Barnes, a retired elementary school teacher who had lived on Birchwood Lane for 22 years. She was sitting on her front porch when the patrol car pulled up, and she had watched the entire encounter unfold with growing horror. Dorothy knew Terrence Washington. She had watched him move into that house 13 years ago. She had attended his daughter's birthday party last spring and brought a casserole when his mother passed away the previous winter. She knew he was a therapist, knew he worked with troubled kids, knew he was exactly the kind of man every neighborhood wished they had more of. She was already recording on her phone when she stepped off her porch. Her voice, captured on that recording, trembles with fury and disbelief. "That man lives there," she shouted, walking toward the scene. "You've got the wrong person. He's a homeowner. Let him go." The officers did not respond. They did not even glance in her direction. Other neighbors began to emerge. A man who had been walking his dog stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, his mouth hanging open in shock. A young couple unloading groceries from their car froze, bags forgotten in their hands. A teenage boy biking home from school skidded to a halt, dropped his backpack, and pulled out his phone to record. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Their phones were raised, cameras trained on the scene unfolding on Terrence's porch. Their voices overlapped as they tried to communicate what should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. "He lives here. That's his house. Let him up. He's not fighting you. What are you doing? There are children watching." The collective testimony of an entire neighborhood was being offered freely and loudly, and the officers ignored every word. Their tunnel vision was absolute. They had been told there was a predator, and they had found a black man who matched the description, and nothing else mattered. One officer tightened the handcuffs around Terrence's wrists until the metal bit into his skin. The other kept his knee planted on Terrence's neck, applying pressure that made each breath a struggle. Between the weight crushing his chest and the pressure on his throat, Terrence's voice became weaker, his words harder to form. He stopped speaking, not because he had given up, but because he could no longer get enough air to form words. The footage captures this moment with terrible clarity, the exact instant when a man who had done nothing wrong runs out of breath to defend himself. A young woman named Jasmine Carter was passing through the neighborhood on her way home from work. She did not know Terrence Washington personally, but she knew what she was seeing. She recorded 37 seconds of footage from across the street. Her phone held steady despite the trembling of her hands. When the officers finally pulled Terrence to his feet and led him toward the patrol car, she stopped recording and immediately began typing. Her post was simple. "Police just tackled a man on his own porch in front of his kids. He wasn't doing anything. This is Birchwood Lane in Maplewood Heights." She pressed post before she even finished walking to her car. By the time she arrived home 15 minutes later, the video had been shared 3,000 times. By the time she went to bed that night, it had been viewed by more than 100,000 people. And by the next morning, it would be everywhere. The fire had been lit, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The first wave of media coverage was a disaster of misinformation and implicit bias. Before the sun rose the next day, before anyone had bothered to investigate who Terrence Washington actually was, headlines had already begun to spread across local news websites and social media platforms. "Black male apprehended near Maplewood Heights playground." One outlet reported the word apprehended carrying implications that no honest journalism should have allowed. Another was more explicit in its assumptions. "Police detain potential threat in family neighborhood." But the worst headline came from a regional affiliate that should have known better. "Suspected predator tackled outside suburban home." The word suspected was doing enormous work in that sentence, attempting to shield the outlet from liability while simultaneously destroying a man's reputation. No evidence was offered. No sources were cited. A man had been pinned to the ground by police officers, and that was enough for some outlets to assume he must have done something to deserve it. The comment sections beneath these articles filled with poison. People who had never met Terrence Washington, who knew nothing about him beyond the color of his skin and the fact that police had detained him, felt confident in their assessments of his character. They called him a predator, a monster, a threat to the community. They praised the officers for their quick action. They worried aloud about what might have happened if those brave men hadn't intervened. It was character assassination by assumption, a man's entire life reduced to a 37-second clip that had been filtered through the lens of institutional racism and regurgitated as truth. But the narrative was already beginning to crack. The footage recorded by neighbors told a different story, and that story was spreading faster than the mainstream media could control. Dorothy Barnes's video showed the officers arriving without announcement and escalating immediately to violence. Jasmine Carter's recording captured the neighbors' desperate attempts to intervene, their collective testimony that this man lived in that house and had done nothing wrong. A third video, taken from a different angle, showed Terrence's daughters standing in the doorway, their faces contorted with terror as they watched their father being brutalized. Social media did what it often does in moments like this. It organized, it demanded answers, it refused to accept the official narrative. The hashtags emerged within hours. Justice for Terrence, Wrong Door, Wrong Man, Maplewood Brutality. They spread across platforms, each share adding fuel to a fire that the police department had not anticipated and could not control. By midday, the story had jumped from local to national. Major networks were picking it up, running the footage side by side. The body cam video that showed officers shouting commands without explanation, and the civilian recordings that provided the context, the official footage conveniently obscured. The question on everyone's lips shifted. It was no longer, what did he do? It had become, why was he touched at all? The police department's first official response came 18 hours after the incident, a press release so carefully worded that it managed to say nothing at all while using a great many words to do it. Officers responded to a report of a suspicious individual in a residential area. Based upon the information available to them at the time, officers approached the individual to conduct a welfare check. During this encounter, the individual was briefly detained while officers confirmed his identity. The department is committed to a thorough review of this incident and will take appropriate action as warranted by the facts. That was it. No acknowledgement that the man detained was a homeowner. No mention of the children who had witnessed the encounter. No reference to the knee that had pressed down on Terrence Washington's neck while he gasped for air. Just bureaucratic language, carefully neutral, designed to minimize liability rather than explain what had actually happened. The response might have worked in an earlier era, before cameras lived in every pocket, before a single video could circumnavigate the globe in hours. But this was not that era. The statement was dissected, mocked, and condemned within minutes of its release. Welfare check, one viral tweet demanded. Since when does a welfare check involve tackling someone and kneeling on their neck? They confirmed his identity after they put him in handcuffs, another pointed out. That's not procedure. That's assault. The phrase reasonable suspicion became a target of particular scorn. What exactly was suspicious about a man standing on his own porch with keys in his hand? What reasonable person would look at that scene and conclude that violence was necessary? The answer, of course, was obvious to everyone who had watched the footage. The only suspicious thing about Terrence Washington was his skin color. Everything else, the violence, the shouting, the refusal to listen, had followed from that single, damning assumption. A petition calling for the officers to be suspended pending investigation appeared online that evening. It gathered 20,000 signatures in 6 hours, then 30,000, then 50. By the following morning, it had crossed 100,000. Local politicians who had initially remained silent began issuing carefully worded statements expressing concern. Community leaders demanded a town hall. Churches announced vigils. The protest infrastructure that had been built over years of similar incidents activated with practiced efficiency. Outside the Maplewood Heights Police Department headquarters, a crowd gathered as the sun went down. They carried handmade signs with messages that had become tragically familiar. No justice, no peace. Hands up, don't shoot. His crime was coming home. The chants echoed off the glass and concrete of the building, a rhythmic reminder that the community was watching and would not be satisfied with empty words. Inside the department, leadership scrambled. Public relations staff worked through the night, drafting and redrafting statements, trying to find language that would calm the storm without admitting wrongdoing. But every hour brought new revelations, new footage, new details that made their position more untenable. The cover story was not holding, and soon the whole world would know why. The investigative journalist who would ultimately crack this story open was named Michelle Rodriguez. She worked for a local outlet that had been covering community issues in Maplewood Heights for over a decade, and she had seen too many cases like this one to accept the department's sanitized version of events. Her first step was straightforward: file a public records request for the original 911 call. The department initially delayed, citing an ongoing investigation. Michelle pushed. She knew her rights, she knew the law, and she knew that the call was the key to understanding everything that had followed. 3 days after the incident, she received the audio file. What she heard confirmed her suspicions and fundamentally altered the trajectory of the case. Sandra Lawson's voice on the recording was not panicked. It was not fearful in the way one would expect from someone who had genuinely witnessed threatening behavior. It was calm, almost casual, with the particular cadence of someone filing a routine complaint. "I'd like to report a suspicious person," she said. "There's a black man sitting in a car near the recreation center. He's been there for a while, watching the children." The dispatcher asked clarifying questions. Had the man approached any children? Had he spoken to anyone? Had he done anything threatening? No, Sandra admitted. He had simply been sitting in his car. But there was something about him, she insisted, the way he was watching. It made her uncomfortable. That was the entire basis for the police response. A man had sat in a parked car near a public facility. A woman who did not know him had observed him from a distance and felt discomfort. She had not approached him to ask if he needed assistance. She had not considered that he might be waiting for a child of his own. She had seen a black man in a space where she did not expect to see one, and she had decided that warranted a call to 911. Michelle's investigation did not stop there. A simple search of court records and public databases revealed that Sandra Lawson had made multiple similar calls over the past several years. In one case, she had reported a black teenager for walking his dog on her street, claiming he looked like he was casing houses. In another, she had flagged a Latino delivery driver for lingering too long in his van. In a third, she had called about a black woman sitting in a parked car whom she suspected of dealing drugs. The woman had turned out to be a real estate agent reviewing property listings between appointments. Every single call had been unfounded. Every single one had wasted police resources and subjected innocent people to suspicion based on nothing more than their appearance. And the department had responded to every single one, never once questioning the pattern, never once considering that Sandra Lawson's definition of suspicious might be fundamentally flawed. When Michelle confronted the department's spokesperson with these findings, the response was silence, followed by a promise to look into the matter and get back to her. That callback never came. The story Michelle published 3 days later laid out the facts with devastating clarity. The police had responded to an unverified report from a caller with a documented history of racial bias. They had used force against a man who had committed no crime on his own property in front of his children. They had ignored the testimony of multiple witnesses who told them loudly and repeatedly that they had the wrong man. And they had issued a statement that obscured all of these facts behind bureaucratic language designed to minimize accountability. The article was shared hundreds of thousands of times. It was picked up by national outlets. It was read aloud on cable news programs. And it made one thing absolutely clear. What happened to Terrence Washington was not a misunderstanding. It was the predictable result of a system that treats black presence as presumptive evidence of threat. Terrence Washington had never wanted to be a public figure. He was a private man who valued his family, his work, and the quiet rhythms of suburban life. He had built a career helping young people navigate difficult circumstances, and he had done so largely out of the spotlight, preferring action to attention. But the spotlight had found him anyway. And after days of watching his name dragged through headlines, watching his children afraid to go outside, watching his community convulse with anger and grief on his behalf, He made a decision. He would not remain silent. He would fight back. The legal team he assembled was formidable. Leading the effort was a civil rights attorney named Marcus Holloway, a partner at a national firm that had won landmark cases against police departments across the country. Joining him were two local attorneys with deep roots in the Maplewood Heights community and extensive experience navigating the particular challenges of suing a municipality. Within 10 days of the incident, they filed a formal notice of intent to sue. The defendants named in the filing included both officers involved in the detention, the Maplewood Heights Police Department, and the city itself. The charges were comprehensive: unlawful detention, excessive use of force, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, failure to intervene, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. A separate line in the filing named Sandra Lawson as a contributing party. While criminal charges for filing a false report were unlikely given the vague language she had used, civil liability was a different matter. The lawsuit alleged that Lawson had knowingly and recklessly made a report she knew or should have known was baseless, and that her pattern of similar calls demonstrated a disregard for the consequences her actions might have. The legal strategy was clear from the outset. This would not be a quiet settlement. This would not be resolved behind closed doors with a non-disclosure agreement. Terrence's team wanted depositions, discovery, court records, precedent. They wanted the facts laid out in public where everyone could see them. They wanted accountability that could not be walked back once the cameras moved on. Major civil rights organizations quickly rallied behind the case. The National Legal Defense Fund issued a statement calling the incident a textbook example of racial profiling and pledging resources to support the litigation. The state chapter of the Civil Liberties Union announced it would file an amicus brief if the case went to trial. Local advocacy groups organized community support meetings and established a legal defense fund to help cover costs. And then the federal government got involved. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice announced a preliminary review of the incident, citing concerns about possible civil rights violations. While not yet a formal investigation, the announcement signaled that what had happened on Birchwood Lane had risen above local politics. Depending on what the review uncovered, the city could face a consent decree, a court-supervised agreement requiring systemic reforms that would fundamentally reshape how the department operated. Terrence Washington stood before a cluster of microphones at a press conference 10 days after the incident. He wore a simple gray suit and the same glasses that had been knocked from his face during the encounter. His wife stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. His children were not present. He had insisted on protecting them from further exposure. When he spoke, his voice was steady. He did not shout. He did not rage. He delivered his words with the careful precision of a man who understood that this moment would be replayed and analyzed and remembered. "I was tackled on my own porch," he said, "in front of my children, for the crime of coming home from work. I did everything right. I complied. I explained. I kept my hands visible, and none of it mattered, because the officers who approached me had already decided what I was before they even saw my face." He paused, letting the words settle. "This is not just about me. This is about a system that sees black skin and assumes threat. This is about police departments that respond to fear as if it were fact. This is about children growing up in a country where their fathers can be brutalized on their own property while neighbors beg the police to stop." Another pause. "I am not asking for revenge. I am asking for change. Real change. Not promises, not press conferences. Change you can measure. Change that protects the next person. Because if this can happen to me, a man with no record, on my own property, in front of witnesses, it can happen to anyone." The room was silent. The cameras continued to roll, and somewhere across the country, millions of people watched and understood that this was about so much more than one man's terrible afternoon. I want to pause here and ask you something directly. What would you have done in Terrence's position? How do you think you would have felt looking up at the cameras and microphones, knowing the whole world was waiting to hear what you had to say? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. The internal affairs investigation that followed was launched not out of principle, but out of necessity. The department had been backed into a corner by public pressure, media scrutiny, and the looming threat of federal involvement. There would be no quiet resolution. There would be no waiting for the story to fade from public consciousness. The world was watching, and the world demanded answers. The first revelation came quickly. One of the officers involved in the encounter, a 12-year veteran named Sergeant Victor Maldonado, had a personnel file that read like a warning no one had heeded. 5 previous complaints of excessive force. 3 of those complaints involved black men stopped during a routine traffic encounters. 1 formal reprimand, 0 suspensions, 0 terminations. The pattern was clear to anyone who bothered to look, but apparently no one in the department had bothered. The second officer, Brian Kowalski, had been on the force for only 3 years. His record was thinner, but not unblemished. 2 complaints in his short career, both involving aggressive behavior during minor stops. Both dismissed after cursory investigation. When these details became public, leaked by sources within the department who had grown frustrated with years of stonewalling, the outcry intensified. This was not a single bad encounter. This was a pattern. This was institutional failure. This was a department that had allowed officers with documented histories of problematic behavior to continue operating without meaningful oversight. Both officers were placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation. It was a standard move, designed to appear responsive while changing very little. Officers on leave continued to receive their full salary. They remained employed by the department. They faced no immediate consequences beyond a temporary removal from active duty. Meanwhile, Sandra Lawson found herself at the center of a different kind of scrutiny. Court filings in the civil case had named her as a contributing party, and that filing was a matter of public record. Her name was published in news reports. Journalists appeared on her doorstep seeking comment. Neighbors who had previously smiled and waved now crossed the street to avoid her. Lawson retained an attorney and declined all interview requests. A brief statement issued through her lawyer expressed regret that her call had led to such an unfortunate outcome, but maintained that she had acted in good faith and with genuine concern for community safety. The statement satisfied no one. Critics pointed out that her previous calls, documented in court records and news reports, demonstrated a pattern of behavior that went far beyond a single moment of poor judgment. Civil liability loomed large. While criminal prosecution for filing a false report remained unlikely, the lawsuit sought to hold Lawson accountable for the foreseeable consequences of her actions. If successful, it would establish a legal precedent that weaponizing emergency services based on racial bias carried real financial consequences. The city council convened an emergency session. The chamber was packed beyond capacity, with residents lining the walls and spilling into the hallway outside. The public comment period, normally limited to 3 minutes per speaker, was extended indefinitely as person after person rose to share their testimony. Teachers who had worked with Terrence Washington spoke about his dedication to the community's children. Parents whose teenagers had participated in his mentorship programs described the positive impact he had made. Neighbors recounted the countless small kindnesses he had shown over 13 years. Church members, coaches, colleagues, friends. Each story added another layer to the portrait of a man who had given his life to service and had been repaid with violence and humiliation. But it was the final speaker who left the deepest impression. A young black man, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, stepped to the microphone. He spoke haltingly, nervously, clearly unaccustomed to public speaking. "Mr. Washington was my mentor," he said. "When I was 15, I got into some trouble. My parents didn't know what to do with me. I was angry all the time, getting into fights, failing school. Mr. Washington took me under his wing. He didn't judge me. He didn't lecture me. He just showed up week after week and helped me figure out how to be better." The young man's voice broke. "I watched the video. I saw them put him on the ground. And I thought about all the times he taught us how to handle police encounters. Keep your hands visible. Stay calm. Be polite. Follow instructions. He did everything he taught us. Everything. And they still hurt him." He paused, composing himself. "If that can happen to Mr. Washington, what chance do the rest of us have?" The chamber fell silent. Even the council members, typically practiced at maintaining neutral expressions, looked shaken. Outside, the protest continued, voices rising and falling in rhythmic chants. Justice for Terrence. No justice, no peace. The system is the problem. By the time the session adjourned, the mayor had committed to forming an independent review board, expanding bias training, and implementing new protocols for 911 call verification. They were promises that had been made before, in other cities, after other incidents. Whether they would amount to anything remained to be seen. But something had shifted. The community's anger had found a voice, and that voice refused to be silenced. 3.5 weeks after the incident, Terrence Washington sat for his first and only extended interview. The journalist who conducted it was a correspondent for a major national news program, but the conversation itself was intimate, almost quiet. Terrence wore a deep burgundy sweater and the same glasses that had become something of a symbol in the coverage that followed. He sat in a simple chair against a neutral background. No lawyers flanked him. No prepared statements sat on his lap. Just a man, a camera, and the weight of everything he carried. When asked what moment haunted him most, he did not mention the impact with the concrete, or the pressure on his throat, or the cold bite of handcuffs. He mentioned his daughter's voice. "She was screaming," he said softly, "screaming for them to stop hurting me. That's her voice in my head when I wake up at 3 in the morning. That's her voice I hear when I try to fall asleep. I can live with what they did to me. I'm not sure I can live with what they did to her." He spoke about the surreal experience of seeing himself labeled a predator by strangers who had never met him, the way the word spread across headlines and comment sections, the way people who knew nothing about his life felt entitled to define it. "I have spent 18 years working with children," he said. "I have dedicated my professional life to helping young people find better paths. And all it took was one phone call, one assumption, one lie to turn me into a monster in the public imagination." The interviewer asked about anger, about whether he felt rage toward the officers, the caller, the system that had allowed this to happen. Terrence was quiet for a long moment. "Rage is easy," he finally said. "Rage is what they expect. What I feel is something else, something heavier. I feel the weight of knowing that what happened to me will happen again, somewhere else, to someone else, to someone who maybe doesn't have witnesses, doesn't have video, doesn't have neighbors willing to shout the truth." He leaned forward slightly. "My anger won't change that, but reform might, accountability might. That's where I'm putting my energy, not into rage, into change." When asked what specific reforms he would demand, Terrence was ready. He had clearly thought about this extensively, had consulted with attorneys and advocates, had transformed his personal trauma into a policy agenda. First, verification protocols for emergency calls. Dispatchers should be required to ask specific, clarifying questions before coding calls in ways that prime officers for confrontation. A call about someone sitting in a car should not be routed as a predator alert without evidence of actual threatening behavior. Second, mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. Not a one-time seminar, but ongoing, regularly assessed, with real consequences for failure to comply. Third, civilian oversight boards with genuine authority, not advisory committees that issued reports no one read. Boards with the power to access footage, conduct independent investigations, and recommend discipline that departments would be required to implement. Fourth, accountability for false reporting, civil liability, at minimum, for individuals who weaponize emergency services based on racial bias, criminal liability in cases where the false report leads to injury or death. Calling 911 should never be consequence-free when the motivation is prejudice, Terrence said. People need to understand that using the police as a weapon against black bodies is not just a moral failure. It's an act with real, measurable consequences. The interview concluded with a question about hope. After everything that had happened, did Terrence Washington still believe the system could change? He thought about it. "I have to," he said, "because if I don't, then what was all of this for? The pain my children went through, the trauma my wife is living with, the months of my life consumed by this fight. If I don't believe change is possible, then all of that was for nothing. So yes, I believe. I have to believe, because the alternative is despair, and despair doesn't protect anybody." By the time the interview aired, it had been promoted across multiple platforms. Millions watched. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from across the country. Other victims of similar incidents reached out to share their stories. Politicians who had remained silent suddenly found their voices. And the pressure on the Maplewood Heights Police Department intensified once again. The department's official response came in the form of a heavily staged press conference. Behind the podium stood the chief of police, flanked by city officials and uniformed officers arranged for maximum visual impact. The prepared statement was read with practiced solemnity. New protocols would be implemented immediately. All emergency calls involving vague descriptions would be reviewed by supervisory personnel before officers were dispatched. Implicit bias training would become mandatory for all officers, with annual refreshers required. A civilian oversight board would be established, with authority to review high-profile use-of-force incidents. The announcement was greeted with skepticism by community advocates who had heard similar promises before. Press conference reforms, as one organizer put it, had a way of evaporating once the cameras moved on. Civil rights organizations offered cautious praise while noting the devil would be in the details. Would the oversight board have real power or merely advisory status? Would training be substantial and ongoing, or a single afternoon of box checking? Would the protocols actually change behavior or simply add paperwork? The questions that went unanswered spoke louder than the reforms that were announced. There was no timeline for discipline against the officers involved. There was no commitment to releasing the internal affairs findings. There was no indication of whether Sergeant Maldonado, with his extensive history of complaints, would remain on the force or be terminated. The federal investigation added another layer of uncertainty. Department of Justice officials continued their review, examining not just this incident, but the department's broader patterns and practices. If they found evidence of systemic discrimination, the city could face a consent decree, years of court-supervised reform that would transform how the department operated. Legal experts predicted the civil lawsuit would end in settlement. The footage was too damning, the facts too clear, the public relations damage too extensive for the city to risk a trial. But Terrence's legal team remained publicly committed to seeking court records and establishing precedent. They wanted discovery. They wanted depositions. They wanted the truth laid out in official documents that could not be denied or buried. As the weeks stretched into months, the immediate intensity of the case faded from daily headlines. Other stories demanded attention. Other tragedies unfolded. The news cycle moved on with its characteristic relentlessness. But the work continued. The lawsuit proceeded through the courts. The federal review advanced. The community organizations maintained their pressure, and Terrence Washington kept showing up at city council meetings, at community forums, at every venue where his voice might make a difference. People want this to be over, he said at one such meeting. They want to move on, restore normal, get back to business as usual. But normal is what got us here. Normal is what put me on the ground in front of my children. If we go back to normal, we've learned nothing. He surveyed the room. I'm not asking for normal, I'm asking for better. There is a moment near the end of the body camera footage that rarely gets discussed. It happens after Terrence has been pulled to his feet, after the handcuffs have been tightened, after the officers have begun leading him toward the patrol car. For just a few seconds, the camera captures a clear view of his front door. His youngest daughter is standing there. Her face is wet with tears. Her small hands are pressed against the glass of the storm door. She is watching her father being taken away, and her expression is one of absolute devastation. That image, more than the tackle or the knee or the shouting, captures the true cost of what happened on Birchwood Lane. This was not just an assault on one man. It was an assault on a family. It was trauma transferred to children who will carry it for the rest of their lives. It was a lesson taught in the cruelest possible way that the place you feel safest, your own home, your own porch, your father's arms, can be invaded without warning by forces you cannot control. The reforms announced by the department may help prevent similar incidents. The lawsuit may result in financial accountability. The federal investigation may lead to systemic change, but none of it will undo what those children witnessed. None of it will erase the memory of their father's face pressed against concrete. None of it will restore the sense of safety that was stolen from them in 37 seconds on a Thursday afternoon. This is the reality that statistics cannot capture. Behind every case of unjustified force, there are children who watched, families who broke, communities that lost trust, lives that were never quite the same. Terrence Washington understood this better than anyone. It was why he continued to fight even when the cameras left and the headlines faded. It was why he kept showing up, kept speaking out, kept demanding more than press conference promises. Justice isn't just about one person standing back up, he said during one of his many public appearances. It's about making sure no one else gets knocked down like that again. It's about protecting the next family, the next child, the next man who just wants to come home from work without becoming a headline. He paused. That's what I'm fighting for. Not revenge, not headlines. The simple right to exist without fear in my own neighborhood. That's not too much to ask. It shouldn't be too much to ask. The question now is whether the system will answer, whether the reforms will hold, whether this case will become precedent or just another story, whether anything will truly change. The answer, as always, depends on all of us, on what we demand, on what we accept, on whether we're willing to stay engaged, even when the cameras move on. This story matters, not because it's unique, but because it isn't, because versions of it play out in neighborhoods across this country, week after week, year after year, because until the pattern breaks, until the assumptions change, until Black presence stops being treated as presumptive evidence of threat, there will be more porch steps, more handcuffs, more children screaming for their fathers, and more of us asking why it keeps happening, why no one stops it, why the system seems designed to produce exactly these outcomes over and over again. The footage from Birchwood Lane will remain in the public record. The case will proceed through the courts. The reforms will be implemented or ignored. And somewhere in another neighborhood, another man will pull into his driveway after a long day at work, and someone will decide that his presence makes them uncomfortable. What happens next will depend on whether we've learned anything at all. Before I close this out, I want to hear from you directly. Do you think justice will truly be served in cases like this? Do you believe the reforms will hold, or will they fade once the public moves on? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if you believe these issues matter and deserve more attention, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another deep dive into the stories that shape our world. Because the more of us who are paying attention, the harder it becomes for these patterns to continue in the shadows. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. I know it was difficult. I know it was heavy. But I believe you needed to hear it. And I believe that together we can demand something better than what Terrence Washington and his family received. Until next time, stay engaged, stay aware, and never stop asking questions.